very delighted to have been invited to the CONSOC to give a talk today. I've been a member, not quite sure how long actually, probably about 12, 13 years, and have gained an awful lot from my membership of the society. I haven't been as active over the last few years. It's been quite a busy time at work and things, but I have still been able to get out onto the seashore. And so the talk this afternoon really, because when you're out on the seashore, I don't know about other people here, but I always feel as though you need to be doing something. I mean, it's all very well having a nice walk, but actually when there's a sort of wealth of marine life and things around you, it seems a shame just to walk somewhere and then walk back. It's always good to have an objective. And so what we're talking about today is the results of slightly eccentric citizen science project that was begun a few years ago by a group of us, really around trying to answer some of the questions that had arisen for Ormers, which we'll explain what they are at the moment for those who don't know. Kick off. So probably today's talk, not going to be a great many answers to questions, because we're only just at the stage of analysing the data sets and things. So what you're seeing are provisional results, and so they have to be accepted as such, but hopefully in the coming sort of months or whatever, this will be tightened up, and we can actually start to get some proper information. Brief introduction as to the area that we're talking about. I don't know whether, I presume most people are probably familiar with the Channel Islands. If not, hopefully you're familiar with the English Channel. And the Channel Islands are on the south side of that, caught in that little L shape between West Normandy and Northern Brittany. And there are two bailiwicks there, Guernsey, which comprises Sark and Alderney, and then the bailiwick of Jersey, which is outlined on the chart on the left there. It's an extraordinary area from a marine life point of view. Jersey has a tidal range that can be up to 12.2 meters or even 13 meters in the reef, the Minkies to the south there. And because of that, and because of the topography and things, we get huge areas of seashore, up to 36 kilometers squared around Jersey itself. At low water, gets exposed. And again, because of the topography and the sort of mixture of habitats and rock and sand and things, it generates these incredibly complex areas. So you have these sort of rock plateaus, in between which are enormous rock pools, huge, what we call gutters, which is essentially I don't know what you call it really, a sort of channel. They can be up to 2-3 kilometers long, and sort of a couple of 100 meters wide, and they'll be filled with water permanently at low water. So there's a very complex and rich series of habitats and things there. And the Channel Islands, for reasons we're not entirely sure, but probably because the English Channel is a barrier for various reasons, represents the northern limits of quite a few species. Around about, I think we did work out, it was either 1.5 or 3% of the species that we're aware of seem to stop there, including a lot of mollusks. You're probably familiar with Pennant's top shell, for example, and some of the very small ones whose name I've completely forgotten now, the milky white shells and other things like that. And of course, Ormers, which is probably the most famous sort of Channel Island mollusk in those terms. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction to Ormers. I realise not everybody will be absolutely familiar with them and the insides and out of their biology. Nor am I, to be honest with you. Much of this project has been around studying their behaviour and occurrence and habitats and things. The thought being that when we actually start analysing the data and things, we'll get into the biology and things properly then. But it's worth sort of saying the Ormer, it's a local name. They're known as abalones around the rest of the world, or abalone, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it. And Ormer's contraction of oreille de mer, which, because of the shape, you can sort of see the one that's there. They are this ear-shaped shell. They are a relative, I'm probably going to get shot down in flames for saying this, a relative of the limpet, in the sense that it's a half shell, there's a muscular foot with which it grips to the rocks. And in fact, actually, here we go, we've got one here, and this beautiful sort of mother of pearl interior that sort of characterizes them. And then on the outside, very distinctive sort of zigzag patterning that goes on. And they will habitually be found on the seashore and in the very subtidal areas down to about 10 meters. And they'll be found in crevices and under rocks where the foot, a bit like a limpet, will stick to the rock itself. And once they make up their minds they're stuck there, that's it really. It's very difficult to move them. They are very heavily fished. We'll talk about that a bit later on. And there are historical instances of the local stock having collapsed, probably through overfishing in the 19th century, but also disease, the Vibrio virus that hit our Ormer sort of population about 25 years ago, sort of had 90% mortality. We lost nearly the loss. It was extraordinary. That was regional. That wasn't just the Channel Islands. People have tried to farm them, but that's always proved to be problematic. They tend to climb out of the tanks you put them in, or for reasons that aren't understood, suffer from mass mortality. And because it's one of those creatures that they need to be farmed for 4 or 5 years before they're actually commercially valuable, to lose the stock in one go, which is what tends to happen, obviously, makes it very commercially difficult. So there have been a few attempts, but no successful ones locally. And there are ventures and things in France that have been slightly more successful. I'm not going to dwell on other studies either, but there are quite a few. Most of them, funny enough, do seem to have been done in the Channel Islands or in that little L shape between Normandy and Brittany, and that's partly because that area does seem to have a particularly high concentration of Ormers. I mean, its range does go from the sort of Gulf area there, the Channel Islands in effect, all the way down to the Canary Islands, including the Mediterranean. But our little area does seem to be somewhere where they are particularly abundant. So it's why we end up with being a lot of studies and things, particularly in the 60s and 70s when people were thinking about sort of aquaculture and things, but obviously there's been genetic studies and stuff since. Despite that, there's actually relatively little known about the habitats and behavior intertidally. Most of the studies have been done on subtidal ones or ones that are in captivity. And this was something that led to our project that we're talking about today, which has got the original and exciting name of Project Ormer. I'm not sure why we couldn't think of anything better than that, but that's what happened. And it came out of several things, really. There's quite a lot of us, including some of the people online here, who spend hours walking on the beach and rock pooling, looking at things, and obviously come across rock pools with Ormers in, and some of those areas sort of fished, and I'll again talk about this in a minute, and some weren't. And then I think from a personal perspective, whilst because I work for the local fisheries team, and that involves doing patrols and inspections and things, it was a 2016 encounter with a French fisher who was down at the Minkies, the reef to the south of us, and he had some Ormers that he shouldn't have had, and so you have to go through a process of cautioning people and then sort of going through it. And we were chatting, and he was sort of saying, well, you know, do the Ormers move? How far do they move? And was asking all these questions, which actually had no answers to whatsoever. And that led to discussions within the local marine biology section of the Société Géosiers, which is a sort of an organization locally that a sort of voluntary organization that looks at local culture and science and things. And from that came the citizen science project with a series of questions, which is how far do Ormers move? How fast do they grow? How heavily are they fished? And more basic things like what sort of habitat and things like that do they like? And so in order to get those answers, we decided that we were going to concentrate on intertidal Ormers, so not the subtidal ones, because that was or more problematic, involves diving and things. And we were going to find sites with them, and we were going to do basic habitat surveys for those sites to try and understand their sort of preferences and things and ecology. But then also we thought, well, we need to be able to find and identify individual Ormers so that we can see how fast they grow, see if we can refine them. But also at that time thought, well, actually, if we can find a way of marking them, then if people catch them and we can do a sort of an awareness thing locally, then we can get some idea as to how many are sort of being caught recreationally. Now that presented a couple of logistical issues, first of which is, well, how do you actually tag an Ormer? How do you mark an Ormer? And this actually became quite entertaining in the end. So once you found a site, and there's a sort of typical one at the top there, and again, we'll touch on this briefly in terms of preferred habitat, but you find a site like that, where there's a bit of shallow water, loads of stones, which the Ormers like to live under. And so we said, right, okay, first things first, we're not going to do Ormers in crevices because you can't get them out, you can't measure them and everything else. So wherever they are, they stay there. So we're doing the ones under stones. So go to a site, you turn over the stones, you find the Ormers, you then measure their length, breadth and depth. So in terms of the Ormer, that's the, just to get it the right way around. So length across the shell, breadth across there, and the depth, which actually we stopped doing in the end because it became very difficult to do if they're stuck to a rock, is the bit up at the top there by the proto-conch. You then have to tag this thing, and we found a load of, and you can probably see one in the bottom right-hand corner there, a load of aquaculture tags that an Australian firm had developed. And so we ordered a load, remarkably expensive what they are. They've all got individual numbers on them. They're yellow, so people can see them, which is great. But we then had to find a way of actually attaching them to the shell. And we had thought about other ways of doing this, putting sort of tags through the holes and things, but thought the Ormers might not like it. So in the end, we were put onto this Gorilla glue gel, which is what is in the bottom left-hand picture there, which is just a form of super glue, but a very viscous one. And it's, more importantly, it actually sets on contact with water, which is absolutely perfect for us, or so we thought. So we ended up, you prepare the shell, you put a blob of glue on there, get a pair of tweezers and gently slide the tag into it, press it into the shape of the shell so it picks it up. The tags are vinyl, so they pick up the shape of the shell. And then you can splash water on it, it sets, and you can put the Ormer back. And then before you put them back, you get the GPS position, measure the length and breadth of rock, because we were curious to see if there was a preference in terms of the rocks. They were photograph the Ormer from several different angles, and then also photograph the underneath of the rock that they're on, again, to see if there's an ecological preference there, because you can sort of see in the bottom left-hand corner, when you turn a rock over, there's a variety of different marine life and things under there, encrusting organisms and things like that, but it's possible to identify using photographs. And then all of this was coordinated through a smartphone app, through an free epidemiological thing called EpiCollect 5, which allows you to put information in, take photos and everything else. So it could all be coordinated into one thing. And then when you go back to the site, you resurvey it, you find the tagged Ormers again, or you hope you do, remeasure them, and then go through the same process again of GPS and measuring the rocks and carefully returning them. That was all great. There were a few comedy incidents when you're working with super glue that sets on contact with water and everything is wet. So we ended up with the tweezers stuck to ourselves. I ended up with my lips stuck together once because I thought, put the thing in there, I thought I'll put the tweezers in my lips. I thought, oh, you idiot. And then stuck like that. And all you've got to do is just, well, not bite the bullet because obviously you can't open your mouth, but you've just got to rip your lips apart and do like that. So we ended up with all sorts of comedy incidents. And actually, to be honest with you, in the end, because the tags seem to have a mixed success rate, so after about a year, 50% of them would be lost off the shells. And in the end, photography is a better way of doing it, because the patterns on the shells, I don't know if you can see that one there, patterns on the shells are unique to each animal. And if you can get a decent and clear photo, plus I'll have other things like barnacles in certain positions and other bits and pieces, much better way of doing it, although it's a bit more time consuming. The other thing is that stuff grows over the top of the tags. So you can see the tags there, but you can't read the number on it because it's got barnacles or whatever it is going across the top of it. And you may have gathered from that, no Ormers were harmed in the process of doing this. So very basic results were that we did 141 rock pools were surveyed in the end, 36 of which had sizable Ormer populations. Some of them just had one or two. We had 600, well, I don't know if I need to read all this, but 662 Ormer measurements, of which 536 were individual. So in other words, there's sort of repeat measurements in there, which is obviously what you want if you want to work out how to grow, how they grow. 169 those repeats, yeah. Norma the Ormer, we'll come on to in a moment. She had 40 measurements. One thing that didn't work brilliantly on this was getting people to report tagged Ormers that they had recovered, the fishes and things. We only had 18 people report that, but the quickest of which was within 24 hours of it being tagged. We were told about it. But the local merchant, because Ormers can be sold commercially, used to alert us if stuff came in, which was quite helpful. But there were all sorts of issues with this. We did start off using waterproof paper, which is great. It's one of those things that looks great in principle, but is a disaster on the seashore. Even using pencil and things, it gets smudged. It becomes very difficult to read. Issues with weather and tide, obviously. What else have we got there? Yeah, after we had surveyed the whole island, we actually ended up focusing on a handful of sites, mostly in the southeast of the island, partly because that's where those of us that were most active actually live, so it was more convenient. And then, of course, we move on to Norma the Ormer. And Norma was really, I suppose, one of the things that started this project. Norma, or the earliest I can find having sort of seen her, and I should at this point say this could be Norman, because we never actually, but Norman doesn't rhyme as well. We didn't actually manage to sex the Ormer. That's quite a specialist thing. I'm colorblind, and the people that we tried to do it, nobody really wants to venture how to do it. And that's probably one thing out of this project that we haven't got. The one bit of the data set we should have really is the sort of sex of these things, but we didn't get it. But Norma, I certainly, the first photo I've got of her is 2015, and always under the same rock in the same site. And I realized that by the end of 2016, and then when this project started up at the end of 2016, she was one of the very first ones that we tagged initially. As you can see on the top left there, we were actually using some old Peterson tags, the things we used to use to tag fish, that we had lying around in the department, but they were far too bulky. I mean, they're plastic discs, far too bulky, and none of them stayed on for any length of time, which is why we got the other tags. But Norma, I used to visit. She's probably about a 40-minute walk from my house, and it was accessible on most tides. So I used to try and get to see her at least once a month, sometimes every couple of weeks. Would go there. She'd always be under the same rock, always in the same position. She wasn't an Ormer that was very active, and some are. Some of them, you turn the rock over and you go to reach for something, and by the time you've come back, Ormer's gone and you can't find it. Even though you're in a site where there might be no other stones anywhere else around, that Ormer's gone, and that's it. And they can shift really fast. Not Norma, always in the same position, never moved, never made a fuss. And so I used to go back and thought, well, this is great. We've actually got a control specimen here in the end, something that's always there, something that you can measure again and again and again and again. And so it was. And you can see there's her habitat there, which is what we call a waterfall site. It's where there's a lot of running water over stones and things. And that's her home rock there. And I think that's partly what spared her perhaps from the attention of being fished and things, is that's quite an unlikely rock in the area where it is. If you look at the top photo, there's a lovely big rock in the middle. And when people are fishing, that's what they'll go for. They'll go for, hey, big rock, must be lots of Ormers under there. And they ignore the tiny ones and things that are around it. And we did have one situation. It's not a heavily fished site, fortunately, but people do go there occasionally. And I turned up with my measuring tool, only to find a couple of fishers had just lifted that big rock in the middle and got an Ormer underneath it. And Norma's rock is probably about 10 seconds. I'm stood on it taking that photo there. And I thought, uh-oh, this could be the end of Norma. And we always said with this project, we weren't going to interfere. We were going to be dispassionate and not, get attached to the Ormers and all the rest of it. But I have to confess, I engaged them in conversation. And after about 25 minutes of me talking to them, I could see them look at their watches thinking, oh, it's low tide, we need to do that. And they went off. And they sort of said, yes, it was very good to meet you. And off they went. I thought, well, there we go. That's the way to do it. So there we go. Yeah. There's some stats there. It became a ritual visiting Norma. And I like to think of her as a friend, anyway. Right. I'm going to run through a few of the results from the project, fairly high level at this stage, and you do have to take them for what they are, which is an initial analysis of the data set. First thing is preferred habitat. Well, what do we discover? And these are intertidal Ormers, remember, we're not doing the subtidal ones. There are really two types of habitat. One is a sort of an enclosed rock pool, which is the top right there. And if you find one with that mixture of red seaweed, the dense red seaweeds that you can see there, I think that's Genea, and I think they call it tufted shrubweed, the other stuff that's there. If you see that, that's Ormer heaven. They'll love it. They need a few stones and things to be underneath as well, obviously, but that's that. And it doesn't matter where that is on the seashore. So we've got ones that are up near the high water neap mark, and then obviously they stretch right the way down to the low water mark. The other site, which is on the left there, illustrative of, is just loosely called waterfall sites, and that tends to be where these big channels I was telling you about, they're filled with water, probably millions of tons of water, and they've got to drain somewhere at low tide, and these are where they drain. So it's the exits from them, and they can be these large flat areas where the water flows over. They tend to be pebbly or gravelly, with lots of big stones and things in. And again, the Ormers love it. That's Ormer heaven for them. We did put an automatic temperature logger in a couple of the pools, including Norma's one. And that produced quite a surprise. Admittedly, we did start this a couple of years ago, and we had a couple of very hot summers since then. Sea temperature, or the temperature within those pools, can go from 2 degrees centigrade in the middle of winter up to 27, 28 degrees centigrade. And admittedly, that was this summer, which was exceptionally hot for periods of time, which is quite a range, really. And certainly this summer, we started to see signs of distress with heat in some of our rock pools. There was bleaching of various seaweeds and things like that. And you can see also it's very variable depending on time of year. It's reflective of the equinox tides we get, which tend to be very huge, and you get a far more exaggerated temperature curve in the summer when the pool becomes cut off at low tide. That's it, the water just heats up, and then when the tide comes back in again, it equalizes. There's less of an effect of that at winter, during the winter, much more exaggerated during the summer. Again, this is a good data set, and it's one that we need to look at in a bit more detail. We've got it for offshore things as well. The only one thing we do know is that both offshore, in fact, actually at the seabed, wherever you are in Jersey territorial seas, the sea temperature matches pretty much the air temperature, and we think there's no thermocline or anything within our seas. The huge tides just churn everything over, and so if the temperature drops by several degrees, as it can do during the winter, if you get something like the beast from the east coming in, it will do the same at the seabed. So the entire water column is the same thing, and that's true on the seashore as well. In terms of their behaviour, this is one we still need to unpick, really. They do use the word advisory. They seem to have personalities. I've already sort of mentioned some of them are fairly swift on their feet or foot, and will move at speed. Other ones will just sit there and they're not particularly fussed. During or they tend to be on the edge of rocks during the winter months, and much more underneath otherwise. You can have loads of them on one rock. I think 5 was the record. It might have been more. You can see there's a picture there of 3 on the rock, and they'll share their rock with lots of other species. I've actually seen fish eggs laid right up against the Ormer shell, so that when the Ormer moves, there's a sort of shell shape in the fish eggs, sort of thing. So they are fairly, well, I'll sit on the edge of the rocks in the summer there. Sorry, I didn't mean to say that. And quite often when you turn the rock over, you'll find particularly the bigger ones are actually sat on a bit of seaweed, a bit of kelp usually, or something like that. And that seems to reflect the way that they fish, and is perhaps why Norma had never moved, is because they wait for the food to come to them, possibly not when they're juveniles. And again, that's one of our slight mysteries, which is where are all the small ones? We do find small ones in the sort of rock pools and things, but not many of them. But we do think the bigger ones tend to wait for the food to come to them. And that may be why they prefer water sites where there's a high turnover of water, or perhaps sort of seaweed and things around. In terms of the sort of health and things, they tend to be fairly vibrant, and in terms of their shell and everything else, up to about 10 centimeters in length. And then the shell starts to get dirty. It'll get encrusted with things. It'll suffer from boring organisms, which things like the worms that bore into the thing. So you start to actually get the mother of pearl underneath showing through. The patterns vary hugely between individuals. And the ones that are slightly more mobile may have cleaner shells. That's a personal observation, not quite sure really. They don't have any preference on rock size or lithology or anything like that. And as it says at the bottom there, we never quite worked out where the small ones are, but they are there somewhere, but almost below about 4 centimeters tend to be very rare in comparison to the adults. They never move between rock pools. That's one thing we're absolutely certain of. We've tagged and measured all these Ormers and things. They don't move between rock pools. I'm sure the subtidal ones move all over the place, but you saw the aerial photo of Jersey seashore there. It's difficult to conceive how anything could have enough time during the high water period to actually move between rock pools on that seashore, because there's kilometers of it spread out. So they don't. And in that respect, there's another question to be asked there, which is, are those rock pools in effect, if you've got Ormers and things in them, are they like a sort of sealed aquaculture system? So in other words, if you've got Ormers in there, do they have to be self-sustaining? Does that population have to be self-sustaining? And if it goes, can it be repopulated from elsewhere? It's again, it's something we need to look at. We had 134 Ormers where we knew the rock that it had been under, and 67% of those were under the same rock each time. So a bit like Norma, you turn over the rock and it was the same one as last time. And we know that because we photographed the rocks, and it's possible to compare between things. We've got the GPS positions as well, although they're not accurate enough in most cases, because they will only move a couple of meters if they do move. Not accurate enough to sort of plot distance things. It's not like tracking killer whales or something where they move all over the place. And in terms of mortality, it starts to get quite high, above about 10.5 centimeters. So when an Ormer, if it reaches that sort of age, the shell does get horribly cluttered up, and then they start to disappear from the sites, and that's when we start to find these empty shells and things there. Quite a few of which we've been able to trace back to the original sort of ones, so we've been able to know that that's come from that site. And the older Ormers grow very slowly, and just see if there's anything else there. Yeah, we think I mean, in terms of mortality, fishing is probably the highest cause in terms of intertidal ones, and again, that's something we'll touch on just briefly in a second. Although it's worth saying, actually, because I go out with some Ormer fishers, and it was something I used to do in my youth, although not very well, and was surprised to find that there's a culture in some parts of the island of actually almost ranching the Ormers. So they know that the pools that they're in, and they're aware, because there's a size limit of 9 centimeters, you can't take anything below that. Their fishers are aware of that, and they'll know that in that pool, they've taken all the ones that are 9 centimeters, and there are some that are just coming up there, but so they need to leave that pool alone for 18 months. But quite often, they prop rocks up, either to encourage Ormers to get underneath, or because there's an Ormer under there and they don't want to squash it when they put the rock back. And that's a very common way to see if an area has been fished, is whether the rocks have been propped. Right, growth. Yep, we did all these measurements. The smallest one we measured was 1.6 centimeters, the largest 12.5. We have come across one that's 13 centimeters when we're doing our fisheries inspections and things. So, but that's quite unusual. Anything above 12 centimeters is noteworthy. Growth is isometric, which means they grow in all directions at the same time. And you can sort of see on the left-hand side, there's a data set that we got from an aquaculture study that was done locally in the 1980s, where the original Ormer, I don't know what the technical term for a tiny Ormer is, when the original tiny Ormers were measured every, I think it was every 50 days or every 60 days. They measured 100 of them, and this is the sort of average size there. We didn't find that many tiny Ormers, but on the right-hand side there is the growth measurements for Norma. So the various times that she was measured, and you can sort of see from that that there are growth spurts, which tends to be in the spring months, sort of makes sense, and that actually towards the end of her life, she seemed to be shrinking. The size is going down. and that's because the shell's degrading. So the edge of the shell seemed to be actually crumbling away. So she wasn't growing anymore, but she was losing progressively more of the sort of shell. This data needs to be analysed properly, but there does seem to be a variation in growth rates between sites. So sites that are higher up on the shore and other things that we haven't taken into account, there do seem to be different rates of growth. There seems to be slower growth rates the higher up the seashore you go. And again, that may, I don't know what that reflects really, perhaps if the pool's being isolated for longer or warmer or whatever it happens to be. And yeah, so we're not sure what triggers the growth things yet, beyond the fact the obvious things could be food availability, tidal height, maybe even the activity of the Ormers. As we say, Norma really grew very slowly compared to some of the other ones we've got. In terms of sites with fishing, we had sites that were fished, and you can tell those pretty easily. You can see the photographs at the bottom there. Because don't ask me why, but people don't return the rocks after they've fished. Drives everyone berserk, including other fishers. But there is always a percentage of people that will leave those rocks the one way, and you can see almost at a stroke whether someone's fished a site or not since you've last been there. But we've got several sites where nobody, as far as we're aware, has been, and certainly not during the time of the project. And there is a different profile in the population there, as you'd expect. There's a 9 centimetre minimum size in Jersey. And at the fish sites, you find very few Ormers that are above 9 centimetres, because people know where those sites are. They've got their eye on the Ormers, and as soon as one reaches 9 centimetres, well, that's it really. It needs to start making its peace with God. But the other sites, you get as you'd expect again, a much wider range, with the bigger ones usually being somewhere in the region of 12 centimetres, give or take. So what have I got there? Yeah, so there are actually a few figures on that. And again, these are provisional, but at non-fish sites, around about 46% of individuals are above the minimum size. At fish sites, tends to be 33%, but that doesn't reflect it entirely, because actually those 33% will usually be just above the 9 centimetres. And again, in terms of density, one of the things that we did do as a very crude way of measuring fishing effort, catch per unit effort, if you will, was to look at the number of rocks that we were turning over in individual sites compared to the number of Ormers that we were finding. And it tends to be slightly denser in, I've got that the right way around. 1 Ormer per sort of 3.5 stones really in the unfished sites. So the density is higher compared to one under nearly 9 stones in the other ones. That's very crude in terms of a thing, but of interest nonetheless. In terms of the fishery itself, I'm not going to touch on this too heavily, as I don't want it to stray into my day job too much. But they are very heavily fished. They are an iconic species. They are something that people will plan their year around in some instances, around the bigger tides, where you can go and sort of fish them on the offshore reefs and things like that. And they've been historically extremely heavily fished. There's a newspaper cutting in the top right-hand side there, which says, after a big tide, the local market had 90,000 Ormers brought to it. And this is in Jersey, tiny area. So it gives you an idea. And there was, in fact, several stock collapses, the most serious of which was in the 1890s, when there were Ormers completely disappeared from on the island. There were still a few on some of the offshore reefs and things, and they had to be imported from France into the markets and things like that. But other ones have occurred as well. The first Jersey regulations were in the 70s, when there was a ban on diving, when a minimum size was put in. And then during this Vibrio disease that I was talking about, which was 1999 to 2002, we had 90% mortality, and the fishery was shut for a period of time then. And the current regulations include a closed season, which is May to October, and various sort of restrictions around tides. You can only fish and possess Ormers for a few days a month around the moons, around the new moon and the big moon. And there's a bag limit of 20 Ormers as well at the moment. And in terms of our inspection records, because I was in the lucky position of being able to actually, whilst people were checking their catches and things as part of the day job, we started measuring the Ormers and things that were coming off. Surprisingly, actually, there's a good size distribution there. And I think that's slightly skewed by the fact that the offshore reefs that we've got, the Main Keys, which is to the south of us, has a very heavy population of ormers, and it's very difficult to access. So it tends to be in a much better condition than on land. But actually the range that was of sort of things, and this is just judging it by eye from a sort of fisheries management perspective, that's not too bad. Usually when a stock's in trouble, the mode size will be banging up against the minimum landing size. And that doesn't seem to be the case there. And then we must return to Norma, who I'm very sad to say is no longer with us. And having visited her faithfully for at least sort of 7 years, in July 2022, the weather was boiling hot and it was a lovely day and things. Went and visited her as usual, measured her 10.63 centimeters, but the shell had not been looking well for some considerable time. It was very degraded. That's Norma there in the bottom left-hand corner. You can see there's all sorts of things growing on there, and you probably can't see it from there actually, but the mother of pearl and things is starting to show through. In August, about a month later, I had a colleague over from New Zealand who's doing a PhD in ormers and things over there. So thought, go and take her to see Norma. And we turned over the rock and sadly, no Norma. And there was no sign that the site had been fished, which is obviously the first thing that comes to mind. And so it's, and because you've been under the same rock for several years, the assumption is that sadly, Norma is no more. We never found the shell. Did have a very good look. Usually if a Norma dies, the shell stays on the site. They're heavy enough not to be affected. Had been a staggeringly hot summer, as I'm sure we all remember. Last year was quite extraordinary, and the rock pools were abnormally hot. Whether that formed a part of it or not, I don't know. To be honest, poor old Norma had not been looking well for some considerable time. And so the death, or assumed death of Norma, really marked the end of the project. Mentally, that, as far as I was concerned, a lot of the citizen science stuff had dropped away. So it was me and a couple of other people that were carrying on with the project. And I thought, well, once Norma's gone, that's it. We'll call it a day. So we are now left with a data set that we must process properly. The project actually is still continuing. You've got to do something when you're on the seashore. So, but it's been combined with the rock pool study on crabs, which obviously involves turning over stones as well. And the data set's being cleaned and prepared for proper analysis. And we need to get on with the process of publishing reports and papers and things that come across with it. There's another project operating similar to this one in Alderney, in the other Channel Islands, which again involves tagging and things. And we're aware that from our project, there is information that's missing. We didn't have any genetic information. We don't know the sex of the individuals that we've been measuring. And we haven't purposely haven't looked at subtidal ormers. One of the suspicions is that actually probably there is a marked difference between subtidal and intertidal ormers, because most subtidal ormers can't be fished. There's a ban on taking them with scuba gear or indeed any form of sort of snorkeling or anything like that at all. So it's probable that the subtidal population is considerably different to the intertidal one in terms of some of the sort of ecology and habitats and things like that. We also need to process all our fisheries records as well as the stuff that we've been measuring. We actually, going back to the 1980s, record catches that people have in terms of the number of ormers and things. So when we're inspecting people, we'll count the number of lobsters, ormers, whatever the hell they've sort of dragged up from the lower shore. Climate change, something we need to bear in mind here. I think for a couple of reasons. Lots of these animals are very sensitive to temperature. It regulates growth, it regulates the ability to breed in terms of the sort of timings and things like that. We're aware of those rock pools getting really hot, and one of the things we have wondered, because ormers in some of the biological literature seem to be triggered at about 18 degrees centigrade into spawning, it's a broadcast spawn sort of thing, and obviously if you do that in an enclosed rock pool, maybe there's a factor there. But we're also where those rock pools hit 18 degrees centigrade round about late May, early June at the moment, whereas the sea temperature won't hit that till August. So maybe the rock pools are giving an advantage to some of the Ormer populations in the sense that if they're breeding early, they have a very short larval planktonic phase, as I understand it, and that may play a role as well. And I'm pleased to say we have Norma Junior, again another very unoriginal name, which is an Ormer that again sat under the same rock. This one's we've encountered a slightly younger age. It's currently 5.5 centimeters and 15 measurements. So the seashore visits, although Norma may be gone, there is still a purpose and a point to sort of going out there, and hopefully Norma will carry on for many years yet. Norma Junior rather will carry on for many years yet. And so that's it really. Probably a bit of a frustrating talk, far more questions at the end of it than answers, but hopefully we've got some information that can contribute to the understanding of Ormers and their sort of place in our culture. That needs to be written up. There's the various stages of Norma's growth. As I say, we've got no shortage of pictures of her over the years and things, and you can see how the shell has deteriorated over time. And it just remains me to thank the people at the bottom of the screen there, all of whom contributed fantastically to this, and I'm aware that a couple of people on the line as well have their own sort of studies of sort of Ormers and things within Jersey as well, so the sort of tradition and the fascination with these animals carries on. And I'll leave it there if that's okay. Thanks.